There you go. Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to SMC Doulas Book Club and Mentorship Circle. I appreciate everybody's understanding as we kind of go a little left of our usual way of meeting together. But this is a very important topic. So I really am grateful for all of you doulas who have come regularly to Circle. That means a lot to me, and to definitely get this information. Yes. So we're going to get started with looking at the ARRIVE trial. Do folks have an understanding of what the ARRIVE trial is? Perfectly fine. So we can talk about it. We'll start by talking about what the ARRIVE trial is, and then look in the results of the ARRIVE trial, how that has impacted our clients. And then we'll look at some new data that's coming out that kind of goes against what the ARRIVE trial kind of sort of said, which is different than, it's even what this trial said is different than what doctors have done with it. So we'll break it all down. And then after we have that discussion, then we will check in, we will talk about books, we will answer questions as much as our time together allows. So I want to introduce wonderful SMC certified doula, Jessalyn Ballarano. And I've called her in to help me because she's got one of the most amazing brains on the planet and has been working with me and my practice to kind of track this trial. And she's heard me scream and cry a million times about the impact of the trial. So she's my go-to gal. Actually, Mika Kate also is one of my go-to gals, but she's busy today. She says hi to you all. So let me just turn it over to you, Jessalyn, and you have screen sharing if you want to share stuff.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all and kind of sort of meet you. Hopefully my brain works today because as I was telling Samsara, I had a flight last night and I was driving since 5 a.m. this morning, so I'll do my best to speak clearly. So the ARRIVE trial is a pretty big deal in how it's changed the landscape of birth practices in the hospital. Has anybody, just wave your hand or give a thumbs up, has anyone heard of it or taken a look or maybe heard about it on a podcast or maybe just from Samsara? I see a thumbs up and a couple waves. Okay. So this was a study that was released in 2018. And we're not going to look at the whole study today, but I think any doula who wants to work with people who are going to be navigating birth in the US and the UK for that matter, should really have this study saved somewhere, and you can take a look and you might read it and it's a lot and it might make sense to you, it might not, depending on your interests and your background. I know I had to read it a few times. I had to look at other sources to really wrap my head around a lot of it, but I recommend reading it more than once and coming back to it and letting it also just be a way of thinking about how research is done and being a way to learn about that in general, because that's something that really shapes a lot of the conversations that our clients have with their providers is research. And research comes in all levels of quality from all different kinds of producers with all different kinds of intentions, from all different communities, well, not all different communities until more recently, and from all different kinds of funding too. So it's just something to start or continue building your own literacy in. I am not a scientist. I don't have a degree in biology or medicine or anything like that. But I keep exposing myself to this kind of work because it helps me to better help my clients understand their options. Because frankly, I don't really want my pregnant clients sitting around reading these really long studies with a lot of numbers and things that could sound scary or stressful, because sometimes they are.
Let me
So I'm
butt
just gonna,
let me just kind of butt in real quick and just say that I love everything that Jessalyn just said, and just point out that it is our responsibility to know. We need to be, as doulas, and especially SMC doulas, walking in the tradition of the grand midwives, we need to know what's up in the environment where our people are birthing, right? And so doing these, knowing this information and doing these studies, it is hard work. It's my brain is not a left brain, it's a total right brain. And so these things are hard. So I'm glad we have the circle and other places where we can get together and talk about it and learn together. But it's really vital for us to know, what's coming towards our clients and what could affect their desire for a physiological birth. Thank you.
thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to just share so you can see what I'm looking at. This is what's called the ARRIVE trial. And the formal title is Labor Induction versus Expectant Management in Low Risk Nulliparous Women. So we've all heard of labor induction. This should say elective labor induction at 39 weeks because they were specifically looking at labor induction that was not done for medical reasons, that was done electively. Expectant management is the phrase they use to refer to the other group of people, not the people who were electively induced, but the people who either went into labor on their own or had a medical need for intervention, or were induced because they went to 41 plus weeks, and our medical system considers that a medical reason to induce. So the reason this title is not labor induction versus spontaneous labor is because you can't control that. Because if you have, say, 100 birthing people who say, I want to go into labor spontaneously on my own, great. Some of them may need medical intervention. Some of them may change their mind and decide to get induced, which is also included in this expectant management group. And some of them may have other health issues that arise that lead to induction at some point. Low risk, just in obstetrical terms, generally is a smaller group in the United States in some ways because we throw a lot of people into high risk categories, but it generally means they don't have major pregnancy complications or other health conditions around their pregnancy. And nulliparous means it's their first time giving birth. So you can find this by just typing in ARRIVE trial. You don't need to memorize the title, but I just wanted to break down what that title is actually referring to. So this was published in 2018. And I think some really important background is that they screened and asked about 50,000 people to participate in this study. And the vast majority of them, over 70%, said, I don't want to participate in this study. So there's your first piece of client-centered information, is that over 70% of the people asked in this study did not want to participate. And so they did not look at 50,000 people. They ended up looking at about 6,000, a little over 6,000 people. 3,000 or so were in that group of elective induction at 39 weeks. And the other 3,000 or so were in this other expectant management group, which included, again, spontaneous labor, but also medical or elective induction that was chosen after those two groups were separated out. What they initially wanted to look at was the impact of 39-week induction, and just see what the impact on infants and birthing people were, particularly, were there any like damaging results in the health outcomes. In a lot of obstetrical research, the kind of outcome that they would consider, worth measuring would be some of those more severe kinds of outcomes, such as death, such as hemorrhage, such as NICU admission. Though the outcomes that aren't usually counted in these kinds of things are breastfeeding outcomes, PPD or other mood and mental health challenges in the postpartum area, childhood driving into the first year. So there's other things that might not be measured, tearing, pelvic floor health, things that are very real consequences of medical intervention for birthing people. Those are not necessarily things that were captured. So what they found in this study, and to be clear, this was a study where everyone knew there was a study happening. The hospitals were participating willingly. So the providers knew they were being observed, and they followed a very specific protocol for induction. And I don't have time to go into all the different aspects of the ways we do induction in the US in different hospitals, but there are different ways, and some of them are safer than others. And in this study, they took the most cautious route that one could, still using those medical interventions. So they were very careful, for example, to not use Pitocin unless they had already done interventions or confirmed that the cervix was very, very soft. In real life, outside of a study setting, not that these people weren't experiencing real life, but outside of a study setting, we also know that induction doesn't always go according to protocol. And sometimes people are given a combination of interventions in a less cautious way. So that's something to keep in mind. What they found in this 2018 study with this very specific set of 6,000 people in these hospitals where they knew they were being observed, they were following very specific protocols. Everyone was low risk, and everyone who was in the induction group agreed to and potentially wanted to, or at least felt very willing with their provider or trusting or decided to be induced. And in my experience as a birth worker, feeling like you have consented to something or feeling excited or trusting of the process can make a big difference in how that medicine takes or how that intervention takes. So that's another thing to keep in mind. In this study, with these willing elective induction participants and this other group that contained a mishmash of people and outcomes, they found that there was no benefits to the outcomes for the infants. There was a statistically significant slight decrease in the number of cesarean sections. And that overall there wasn't major changes in health outcomes. But this was a big deal because finding that the cesarean section rate was lower in the induced group went against all of the research and experience up until that point. So that was a really big deal. Years and years of research had said when we induce and when we look back at people who were induced, we see increasing rates of cesarean section because of what's commonly called the cascade of interventions and the way different interventions can pile onto someone's body and either cause additional complications or stress the baby out or prolong labor to the point of parental exhaustion and all these other things that happen because of certain inductions that all come with their own risks that lead to more C-sections. So the fact that this study with this very specific protocol under observation with a willing group of people found a lower rate of cesarean section, hospitals and providers got very excited about the idea that you could potentially induce people at 39 weeks and lower your cesarean section rate at your hospital. I'm gonna pause there. Is the general gist of the study? Am I getting that across?
Or if there are any questions, we really want to help you understand it if you need that help.
Do you mind, I love how you broke it down. It was very helpful for me. Thank you. Do you mind like saying that summary just one more time? I think that was really a good way to wrap it up. Thank you.
So what they found was that among that group of people who said yes to elective induction at 39 weeks, in which they all received a very specific protocol under observation, in that group, there was a lower rate of cesarean section than in the other group, which included both spontaneous labor and other forms of expectant management. And so what was impactful about the study was that it showed a decrease in cesarean section rates with the use of induction, and that was the opposite of all the research that had been done up until that point. And I know I'm throwing out a lot of points for consideration, which is why I recommend saving this. We're also going to share some other summaries. I think the evidence-based birth summary, while not perfect, is like a helpful way of like thinking down and breaking down the science and like what made the research the way it was. So I do recommend looking at that or listening to the podcast or watching the video from evidence-based birth. But they're basically saying, we are concluding that if you take a bunch of people that may or may not go into labor and you take a bunch of people who chose elective induction and you follow this specific protocol, you can lower your cesarean section rates at your hospital. And overall, we want to lower cesarean section rates as a society, as doulas. We know there's a lot of risk for mamas and birthing people who have cesareans, especially if they repeat cesareans. So that sounds like a great thing. It was also very controversial because, again, 20 years of research on induction, if not more, had shown just the opposite, which is that induction generally leads to increased interventions and often leads to cesarean section rate at a rate higher than spontaneous labor unfolding. I want to offer another piece of context. When I mentioned that they're not measuring all the other outcomes like tearing or pelvic floor health or trauma or breastfeeding rates, that's really important because there's been a lot of hubbub about cesarean section. Understandably, it's a big deal to have abdominal surgery. And it's a big deal that the US has such a high rate of cesarean section. There is something happening in public health where the focus on lowering the cesarean section rate at all costs can actually make the actual parental experience and the family's experience and the maternal health an oversight. Because if you're saying we're going to lower our cesarean section no matter what, our cesarean section rate at a hospital, that could also very well mean that you are putting a birthing person through a grueling induction and stressing out the baby and causing injury and causing these other side effects of interventions when maybe a cesarean section had been a good choice for that person.
Correct.
Right? So like if someone really needs a medical intervention and we want to move them through the process kind of quickly, but we also really want to keep our cesarean section rate low and we know we're being watched, or we know that getting that rate lower is going to get our hospital more money from something or another. That's another factor coming into play where maybe some people who actually need cesarean sections aren't going to get them. Yeah. And so this can be a very convoluted thing when it comes down to it. Sometimes it's about following the money, unfortunately. Most of the time it's about following the money. So this study came out in 2018. A lot of obstetricians who specialize in doing surgeries and who get paid for the birth in a lot less time when there's a cesarean section and are under a lot of pressure from their hospital administrators to move people in and out of those beds. They were like, great, we can induce people at 39 weeks and there's no negative outcome. In fact, we're going to lower our C-section rates and it's not going to hurt the baby.
And so resulted in physicians saying at this point, it's several times to my clients and my apprentices clients and my assistants clients, they're all saying there's no reason to carry a pregnancy beyond 39 weeks. There's no problem in inducing at 39 weeks. And if you're actively in the field right now, you're seeing your perfectly healthy clients, they're all being offered the option of which is not really an induction, it's not really an option, they're being pushed to be induced at 39 weeks, sometimes even earlier.
Yes. And as you've been studying with Samsara, we've learned like there are a lot of benefits to going to full-term pregnancy when that pregnancy and that baby and that person are healthy and thriving. including lung development, which is one of the last things to develop in a baby. So I want you to keep that point of lung development in mind as we continue discussing these. Yes. So the other part of this like study is like there was no benefits other than this supposed decrease in cesarean section measured. Like there were still neonatal deaths in both groups. And they weren't measuring all these other aspects we see with induction around, you know, the pelvic floor and things like that. So just in terms of severe outcomes, they were comparable in both groups. Cesarean section was the main thing. We also know that doulas significantly reduced cesarean section rates, and the difference between the two groups was in the elective induction group, the cesarean section rate was a little over 18%, which is better than our national average. The cesarean section rate in the elective management group was a little over 22%, which is also way better than our national average. And so we also know that when a bunch of providers at a hospital are agreeing to be in a study and they're being observed, generally practice across the board is probably going to be different than in a non-observed situation. Like if Samsara is over my shoulder at a birth, hopefully I'm not being a bad doula when she's not there, but I'm probably a little bit more on my toes and being a little bit more mindful of pausing and thinking about what am I really doing, because somebody that I respect or see as an authority figure is looking over my shoulder. That's just human psychology. Hopefully I'm still doing a good job when nobody's watching, but we're all human, right?
You're a wonderful doula.
So
let me say too that we also, another thing that, you know, that's not being looked at is the psychology. And I think Jessalyn briefly touched upon it. The psyche, what happens to the mama having an induction, and the psyche of the newborn and the newborn to be going through this process of these hard misoprostol / Cytotec, which we know is a highly problematic drug, giving very strong contractions. What is the effect of that on the newborn? What is the effect of Pitocin? What is the effect of being dragged out of your mother's body with vacuum? No one's looking at that. And so we need to take a look at how, you know, our little ones being welcomed into the world with love and grace or fear, right? Now, if a family needs interventions, that's another thing. And then we come in as healers and offer tools to heal what needed to happen to save a life. But if it's just done willy-nilly, that's the concern.
we also know that, you know, there's a lot of ways to compare birthing groups of people, unlike in alignment with what Samsara just said, like comparing a group of people in the hospital who are doing the thing that is very efficient from the hospital's perspective, even though it takes forever, they consider it efficient because they can plan it. What is the treatment of the group who declined that option or was placed in this other group? And there is no protocol for that group, right? So we also don't know in that second group which people decided to get induced because they changed their mind, and which people had a medical induction because they needed one, and which people just went on to have spontaneous labor. So that second group that they're comparing it to isn't even a spontaneous labor group. It's a group of people that included people who really needed to have a cesarean section, or really needed to have an induction, or changed their mind and had an induction. So that higher cesarean section rate in the second group is not a reflection of going into labor naturally, you're going to have this cesarean section rate. It's this entire group of people who were expectantly managed, and that includes people who had medical conditions show up after the study was originally, you know, separated out into these groups. And those people may have needed a cesarean section regardless of any studies happening and regardless of how induction was done. We can't say that because that was not shared in the study. I do recommend, depending on how your brain works, if you take a look at the study, there's that, but and evidence-based birth is also very like statistics number heavy, but their job is to try to translate research as best as possible for people who are not researchers. So that's the second link here. That's the evidence-based birth review of the ARRIVE trial, and I do recommend reading it. They're not quite as straightforward as we would like them to be sometimes, but they do a wonderful, at the time of this writing, they were not as straightforward on this topic. I think they do a great job in most of their work. But this is a very hot topic. So we just, I'm sorry to have strong feelings about this, because we see what's happening.
I hope that,
and I think evidence-based birth teaches enough nurses and universities that they sometimes they have to make very diplomatic writings when we would like them to throw it against the wall.
to break it down in such a way that people can understand who don't have PhDs in the subject.
And they also don't want to scare people who maybe do have good reason for induction, which does happen, that does occur. They didn't want to, create more divisions. That's not what their job is. So I do want to pivot to the other studies, because I have to go to the unemployment office after this and look at a few others. So the first one that we're sharing, this was published in January of this year. All right, January 22, impact of ARRIVE trial on injections at a small academic center. That's a summary of the title. I didn't put it exactly, but it looks like this. So this was actually just a small clinical center that is attached to a university. And they wanted to look at how the publication of the ARRIVE trial impacted the practice of scheduling induction. So they were like, this trial came out, everyone made a big hubbub about it. We looked at our own data at our own facility to see how the publication and propagation of this study impacted this one care center's practices around induction, and if that had any effect on the labor outcomes. So it wasn't a very big study. Remember, the ARRIVE trial was about 6,000 people. This one was just about half of that, about 3,000 people. And they looked at their practice before the study was published in 2018, and then after the study was published in 2018. And so they were looking back at their data in their facility. And they wanted to see, like, how did this study impact this practice at this specific place? And they also just decided to exclude COVID, which I would say, like, opinion-based. COVID exacerbated a lot of this, because we know that staff were under like crazy scheduling shortages, and everyone was stressed and living in a place of serious and valid, like lots of fear, lots of stress, lots of challenges being a healthcare worker at that time. So they excluded from March 2020 forward, but they looked at the year prior to the study and the 2 years approximately, not really, more like a year and a half after the study. In this one, they looked at about 3,000 births total, and they split that about evenly, about 1,500 before and 1,700 afterwards. What they found was that elective inductions definitely increased almost 10%. Increased almost 20% from about 10% before the ARRIVE to nearly 30%. So that's a 2.8 times increase. So they saw their induction rates zoom up in almost a year alone by about 20%. They also found that those inductions happened earlier in pregnancy, among women who were younger, among women who had a higher BMI and had given birth fewer times. And what they found in that specific facility was that the rate of cesarean actually did go up, which is what more so echoes what we'd seen in all the research for the years prior. The rate of cesarean section among the women who were electively induced increased. It about doubled after the ARRIVE study. So they found the opposite of what the ARRIVE trial showed in its study. And this was not a study where people were being observed. This was just practice as usual, except the providers had then been given this ARRIVE trial information. And so they saw that elections increased and elective inductions increased, and that those increases mostly were impacting younger, higher BMI birthing people at an earlier time in pregnancy. That same group of people, after the ARRIVE study was published, not only did they have more inductions, but they also had longer hospital stays, increased blood loss, and lower birth weights. And that makes sense with what we know about all the other research of induction, right? So longer hospital stays, because if you're on Pitocin for 20 hours, you probably need some recovery time. If those Pitocin contractions mean you need pain medication, you probably are going to be under supervision for longer. If you or your baby is injured or stressed out or just physiologically dysregulated from that induction, you probably need to be observed for longer. We know that hyperstimulation of the uterus is more likely to cause hemorrhage. So if you're throwing induction at a uterus that is either taking a long time to respond to that because it wasn't ready to birth a baby because the timing wasn't right, or somebody has sensitivity to that medication, which is totally valid. It's a powerful thing that our body makes, but even more extreme when it's given to us intravenously sometimes.
Right.
People might have that hyperstimulation or that overstimulation of the uterus, and that can lead to hemorrhage. And then lower birth weights make sense because if you're inducing everyone earlier and earlier in pregnancy, and we know due dates are a guesstimate,
please say that.
The chances that we are inducing a baby that is younger and has not gotten fully cooked, as we like to say, yeah, they might be lower birth weight.
And there's another piece that I want to take a look at too, that high BMI. What is that? What do I see when I see that? I see Black people, because overall the BMI is not made for anybody other than what, a 40-something-year-old white man. So it's not fair to women of any color, and it for sure is not fair to Black women, right? And so looking at, and it's important when we're reading a study to look at that, to see our people and see the impact towards our people. That means, you know, so sure, somebody needs to come and do another study on it. That'd be nice, but we can use our common sense from time to time and go, oh, that means this is affecting Black women more.
And we know that racial bias and fat phobia both contribute to, whether formally or informally, placing people in a perceived high risk category from the perception of the provider. So if a provider sees a curvaceous woman, whether she's Black or not, if they see a person that for societal standards is considered fat, and I don't say that as a negative,
that's their concern.
Fat. But if that's happening, they are probably more likely to be offered induction, because we also know that provider assumption of a large baby increases the chance that they will offer induction or cesarean. So not the actual reality of a big baby, but if a physician thinks you may have a big baby, statistics show that you are more likely to be offered these interventions. So this study was just really, I commend whoever, we're like, we're going to look at our own practice and see how this impacted. And this is what they found, was that there was more inductions and that there were some negative impacts of those inductions, including longer hospital stays, increased blood loss, and lower birth weights. And that's linked here under my other comment from evidence-based birth. The next one was a little bit bigger. And this one was also questioning, like, has the ARRIVE trial changed the way we practice obstetrics and the outcomes? And this was also published in January 22. ARRIVE change obstetrics and outcomes. That's how I'm labeling it because I'm not going to write the whole title. And this one, I will share my screen again. This one, again, they recognized that this was a really significant study, and they hypothesized, so they thought that maybe this had an immediate impact on induction practices. And theoretically, if the ARRIVE trial was right, it could have decreased cesarean birth and preeclampsia, which was one of the other things that the ARRIVE trial was hypothesizing would be lower. And again, in that study, they did find some decrease in preeclampsia, I believe, but we also know preeclampsia is stress related. And so if you have people willingly, openly consenting, as opposed to being bullied into an induction, how is that playing into their blood pressure at the time of birth or at the time of term? That was not investigated separately. In this design, they basically, again, they looked at the before and after the publication of the study. So they used that ARRIVE publication in August of 2019 as kind of the pivot point. And they looked at a lot more births in this one. They looked at more in the pre-ARRIVE group, about 16,000, and about 8,000 post-ARRIVE, so about 24,000 total. But they had more data for right before the ARRIVE, which was they did 2016 through 2018 August, and then they only had about a year and a couple months after ARRIVE, because again, 2020 kind of they didn't want to think about how COVID, to be able to statistically measure in how COVID impacted things was probably too complex for their models, although like socially, like from a socially critical perspective, we can have some opinions about that. In this one, again, like the mean age was about 28, so not quote unquote geriatric pregnancies, not the youngest, but there was a range in there. They also had a higher BMI range in this. The mean was 31. And what they found was that total induction rates, both elective and medical, were higher. Time in the L&D ward was higher after the ARRIVE trial came out. And they claim in their results that there were no decreases in the rates of preeclampsia or cesarean birth rates. So what they found there was, yeah, induction rates went up, and there wasn't really any change in those cesarean or preeclampsia rates, not significant enough. So they were saying, like, we did more inductions, or there were more inductions in this group after the ARRIVE trial, but it didn't have the same outcomes that the ARRIVE trial claimed. So this is saying, what they are saying is that this one study really dramatically changed obstetric practice when it comes to induction, and it's not clear that there was any benefit similar to what the ARRIVE trial studied. That in our population, decreases in cesarean birth and preeclampsia have not been realized, raising questions about the applicability of the ARRIVE trial findings in the general population. So they're saying, yeah, this study made a difference in practice. We didn't see the same things that the ARRIVE study saw. We just saw more inductions. And that basically is saying the same thing. Like, we don't know that the ARRIVE study is valid enough to apply it outside of that observed, willing, observed study situation in the original study. They're saying, yeah, we did more inductions, and we still had a cesarean section rate of about 30%. And this was much larger than the ARRIVE study, right? So the ARRIVE study was about 6,000 people. This was 24,000 people. That's 4 times as many people. So a lot more data, and they did not see that decrease in cesarean sections. I'll pause there. All right. Okay, I'm going to do this last study last because it's huge. And again, these studies, these 3 studies we're looking at, they're looking at the data retrospectively. So the ARRIVE trial was not a blind study, but it was like a clinical trial where they were observing and doing the practice at the same time. These 3 studies we're talking about after the fact are them looking at the data and saying, what were the outcomes before and after this study? They're not saying, I hypothesis this, let's go into the hospital and practice and see what happens. Okay, these are retrospective. This last one was also published in February of 2022. And again, it was on changes in OB practice and outcomes following. They all have very similar titles, so again, I recommend saving these. And this one was quite large. And we're gonna look at the conclusion, but we're gonna kind of break it down a little bit because it's a little bit more confusing in how it states what happens. And when you're looking at a study, you'll see the section called the abstract. It's going to give the background, the main objective, how the study was designed, what the results were, and what the conclusion was. But sometimes it takes some rereading or really going into the body of the article, which is not actually here. You have to kind of click through. But sometimes you have to read through even that because sometimes the conclusion kind of brushes over what's actually being said. And a good example of that is I was looking at research on the induction drug, misoprostol, and the conclusion was this is an effective and safe drug. But what they were really looking for was, does this kill anybody? And what is the cost of killing someone? And how much money do we save with the speed of cervical change from this drug? So just because a study has a conclusion that like sounds kind of nice, it depends on what they're measuring for and what their intention and what they're trying to show is. And if they're trying to talk about like the cost of a medication versus the risk of injury, like that might not be the same as saying it's absolutely safe. It might be saying it's safe enough that the risk involved is something you can afford with your liability insurance. Just putting that out there. So this one, again, wanted to see the impact of the ARRIVE trial. This was a really big study. They looked at more years of time. So they looked at January 2015 all the way through December 2017. And then the post-ARRIVE group could only be so long, but it was January 2019. It was basically 1 year. So they had a couple of years of pre-ARRIVE data and 1 year of post-ARRIVE data. They excluded 2018 because that was the time in which the data was like being released and being unfolded. And so they just chose to do it one side and the other on those years. And they were really looking at, you know, what are the rates of induction? How long did timing take in terms of babies being born, people's time on L&D? What was the cesarean section rate? Were people getting blood loss, blood transfusions similar to the other study we looked at? Were people getting admitted to intensive care units? For the babies, they were looking at like, did they need breathing support? What were their APGAR scores? Were they admitted to the NICU? Were there seizures? Things like this. So this was really big. Again, you have it to look at yourself, but in the pre-ARRIVE group, they had almost 2 million births to look at. Wow. And in the post-ARRIVE group, they had a little over 500,000, 600,000. So that's significant, especially considering the ARRIVE study was 6,000 people, which is still significant because they're all still humans. But this is a really big data set compared to a lot of other data sets that we've looked at today. It was all different ages, races, BMIs, marital status, smoking history, and fertility treatment. They did adjust for those as much as statistics can, but we know that, you know, when it comes to human experience, sometimes numbers really can't capture it all.
Exactly.
So what they found about the group of people who received care after the ARRIVE study, they were certainly more likely to undergo induction by about 6%. And they were more likely to deliver by 39 weeks and 6 days. The post-arrived group also had a significantly lower cesarean section delivery rate. Now, they say this is a significantly lower cesarean section delivery rate. In the ARRIVE trial, they claimed 18 versus 22%, which is significant. It's something like, I mean, it's about 4 or 5% if you get into the decimal points. This one, in a really big group of people, it was 27.3% versus 27.9%. So they're saying it's significant because in statistics, if something is more than a few tenths of a percent, you call it significant. But it's not significant like, oh, that is significant, momentous. It means statistically significant. This is a difference of 0.6% in a group of over 2 million people. So it is significant for those people, but it's not a huge difference. It's not like when you look at 27.3 and 27.9, you're like, wow, that cesarean section rate changed really dramatically. That is not what they found. They found that before the ARRIVE trial, the cesarean delivery rate was 27.3, and after it was 27.9. So it was slightly higher. It was also slightly higher in the group that was almost 1 million fewer people. So I'm not a statistician, but when we talk about statistics, that percentage rate, it's easier to change percentage the smaller your group of people is. Okay. So if you're talking about 100 people and one thing changes, you're going to go from 100% to 99% or 10% to 9% really easily because it's just 100 people. If you have 100,000 people, it's going to be a lot harder to move that number in terms of percentages. So if we're looking at 2 million births and we have 27.3%, that number is harder to change than if we have 600,000 births. So just thinking about, yes, it is statistically significant. If both groups had been 2 million people, would it have been different at all? Maybe not.
Right.
So what they also found, so yes, they found this slight shift in cesarean section rate. And the patients in that post-ARRIVE group also had all these other outcomes that were considered negative outcomes. I would say they are negative outcomes. They were more likely to receive a blood transfusion. Again, small percentage, but more likely by their math and their numbers. They were more likely to be admitted to medical intensive care. Again, small changes, but more likely. The neonates, the babies, they were significantly more likely to need assisted ventilation. And again, these are all small changes, but if they're going to say one significant on the other side, we got to say it's significant on the other side too. And it is a lot of people. So when you're talking about 2 million people, even a small percentage is still a lot of human experiences, right?
Yes.
But just remembering that the post-ARRIVE group was 1/3 the size of the other one. So it's like however more people we add to the data set, we don't really know how different that number would be. So if they do this study again in a year, we should look at these statistics again. The babies after the ARRIVE study were also more likely to have a low APGAR score. And the NICU admission rate was about the same. And those are the main differences. So this one's interesting because in their conclusion, they say there were more inductions of labor, there were more deliveries at 39 weeks, and there were statistically fewer cesarean deliveries in the year after the ARRIVE trial. The small but statistically significant increase in some of these adverse maternal and neonatal outcomes should be explored to determine if they are related to these changes in obstetric practice. we live in a society where we have to like document and measure everything in a quantitative way to like say it's true, but this makes a lot of sense that the babies and mothers in the post-derived group had more blood loss, had more need for extended care, maybe needed breathing support because of the same thing we talked about last time. If you're putting someone's body through an induction, there are these additional risks of hemorrhage. If you are inducing everyone earlier, there's an increased risk that that baby was not fully developed in their lungs and might have needed some help. And we just also know, again, as doulas, when you use Pitocin for an extended period, people are more likely to be on epidurals, they're less likely to be moving around. And the combination of those two things is more likely to cause some kind of fetal distress, which could lead to some of those breathing problems after birth. So these are all like nuanced in some ways, but I think when you look at all of them together, it paints a pretty clear picture. And I would say the summary is that, one, they couldn't replicate the ARRIVE trial in normal day-to-day clinical practices. That's not what we were seeing actually happen. We don't actually see a decrease in deaths for anyone because of earlier inductions. And we do see these increased rates of these other outcomes like hemorrhage, like neonatal resuscitation, which can lead to all kinds of both health outcomes, but also experientially and psychologically, what's going on with the breastfeeding journey, what's going on with postpartum recovery, what's going on with the family, what's going on with the parent who feels traumatized and scared as they're welcome into parenthood, right? And these are not studies that look at those qualitative measures the same way that doulas might be thinking about. So I do have to run, but I want to give 5 to 10 minutes for questions.
Any questions or feelings about what has been shared? Let's see if there's anything.
I know it's a lot of information, but it's also like kind of heavy to think about. So
yeah. And it's something to sit with. That's why we make sure you have the copies of all the information that Jessalyn shared has been shared. She shared it, I've shared it. Please take a look at it. We can talk about it the next time we get together for book club. It's a lot of info, but I'm interested in how folks are feeling right now after receiving all of that information. Rose, your hand is up.
I'll go. I find it very important to be able to have these studies. Oftentimes, I feel like as doulas, we don't, not all of us are quite educated in the medical field, and it's very important for us to understand the other aspects and other things that come into play. Listening to these different studies, my mind immediately went to, well, what is the mental health of the mom? What is her mindset when making that decision of her wanting an induction, and how does she truly feel about that? Because I feel like if they're not strong in their stance of the induction or well educated, it's very easy for them to just succumb to it because it's from a medical provider and they feel like they can trust it. And then because they're not educated on the other ripple effects that can happen, it causes more trauma to happen, not with the mother, but also with the partner and with the child. And I think it's important to be able to have time to read these studies and see the whole big picture, but also realize there's other factors not being considered and not talked about, that I feel like is a great discussion for all of us to have, just from a knowledge standpoint. So I'm very grateful that you guys had this available today and I was able to jump on, but also be able to add more to my repertoire of things to read up on and to better educate my mothers.
Absolutely, Rose. Thank you. I'm glad you were able to jump on too. Anyone else have anything that they want to say? A burning desire in your heart. I want to recommend 2 books since I didn't see. Was somebody trying to get on?
Yeah. Yes. I recently met a young woman who gave birth during the pandemic, and she was telling me her birth story. About how she had been induced and how she was very clear that she didn't want to, but the doctors weren't listening to her. And even her partner, he just, he didn't know he wanted what was best for the child, and the doctors were like, putting fear in both of them. So it made me feel sad or listening to this, it reminds me of her, and it made me feel sad for her, and how I wish, she had someone to protect her. It also makes me wonder, like, every woman that I've met, that I'm meeting, that I will meet, like how many of them are living with birth trauma that that they might not even know, and how that might be affecting how they're how they're responding to me in whatever situation. So it gives me a little this information gives me a little what's the word, help me. What's the word?
Grief.
What'd you say?
Grief.
Well, yes, that too, but it gives me I don't know, this isn't the right word, but forgiveness for women.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's very powerful what you're saying. That this is another reason why we all have to be super good to each other. This is why we have to be super good to our mothers and our grandmas and our aunties, with a different level of birth trauma that we've all endured. I definitely, jumping on what you were saying, it fills me with grief, because what I have seen in my career and what I've experienced in my life is birthing a child should help you be bigger. It is designed to make us stronger. We have a healthy pregnancy, eating well, we push that baby out, you feel like you could move a mountain. And so many of our sisters are being denied that possibility to be greater than they were before they got pregnant. Yeah.
Thank you for all of your hearts. And I just shared the Oakland Better Birth Foundation original handout on the Arrive. We're going to update that, but you can certainly take a look at that. And if you use the QR code at the bottom, there's more of these resources involved too. And I'm just going to share that link directly here as well.
Please feel free to share.
And that's additional reading. Yeah.
Feel free to share the data with clients. It's a good way to just have them take a look at everything. If they go to the QR code, eventually the studies that we talked about today will be in there too. So all the discussion about induction is in there. It's a helpful tool, and it's good for you guys to study, to know about induction, all the various kinds of induction. Again, we are doulas, we are not doctors. Our main job is to be able to educate the clients and to trust their decision-making process. But if the clients don't have all the pros and cons, how are they making a decision? We do want to encourage clients who feel that they've been pushed into something that they did not want to take action on that. Write the medical board, write the hospital administration, call up Channel 7 News in your area, because that's not appropriate. That's not good medicine. So yes, we don't diagnose or treat anything, but we do have our common heads and hearts. We are armed with this information, and we give that information to our clients.
Thank you, everyone. I gotta go run to social services. Wish me luck. Bye.
V, bless your heart. Thank you so much for your time, Jessalyn. I so appreciate it. Thank you.
Have a good one, everyone.
All right, beloveds, this was wonderful. I do want to have time for us to all kind of check in, and I'm sure the information that we've received affects our check-in somewhat, but it might not. It's fine. So we have, it's 2:08. We have till 2:30. So if everybody can just take, 2-3 minutes. How are you doing? How are you feeling? You want to check in about a client that, if you want to talk about a client, we don't have time to break down a birth, but maybe next month, if anyone's had a birth in the group, would love to break down our births and learn more stuff. If you're reading a book, how are you feeling about that book? And if there's new books that we need to add to what the circle is reading, let me know that. Who would like to be first, and then pick the next doula after?
I can go.
Oh, I'm going to stop the recording right now, though.